guys. So here we are at our first chapter for general psychology. And we're going to start by talking about research. And I know that, I bet at least, that many of you are not excited about talking about research. Some of you may be. Um, I'm going to do my best to engage you in thinking about this and maybe even getting you to be really interested in what we're going to talk about, but at least getting you to understand why it's so important that you understand this stuff. And this is my kind of the beginning of my attempt to make you critical consumers of information. And by that I mean that you're always, hopefully after this, forever going to want to know where and how somebody got information before you accept that information, including research information that you hear reported about. And hopefully that'll be especially true for research you hear about psychological issues, or that if you're wondering about psychological issues, you think about how someone might study that, or maybe you even study it. Let's go from there. So the first thing is we're going to define psychology as the scientific study of human behavior and mental process. And it's not, the question is why the scientific study? And the reality is that as you and I are social animals, all people are social animals, as we move through our lives, we automatically wonder about the behavior and mental process of other people. Many times probably wondered, watched somebody and thought like, what the heck are they thinking? Or you've watched somebody and wondered, why do they behave that way? Or you've wondered, like, why can't I behave that way? Right? That we think about these things a lot. But our casual observations or our casual questioning is not the same as scientific study. And scientific study is really important if we're going to come up with valid or accurate answers to things. In the science, the scientific study of human behavior makes an attempt to avoid bias. And we do that in part by trying to think objectively rather than subjectively. And so this, we're going to talk about objective and subjective a bunch on and off throughout the semester probably. And so this is a good opportunity to think about what that means. Some of you may already know, some of you may not. But data or information is objective if it is mostly factual and not so much based on opinion or personal experience, right? You may actually recently have, this is kind of something that comes up in our everyday interactions or things we read on social media. So the whole question about whether and to what degree COVID is something we should be concerned about and what we should do if we are concerned, right? You'll hear people say, well, you're entitled to your opinion and I'm entitled to mine. Opinion is subjective. And infectious disease is science. And so we can draw different conclusions from data. We can look at different data to inform our conclusions, but in the end, opinion is a subjective thing. And when there's objective or factual information available to us, that is always going to trump opinion. Which is not the same as interpreting data differently or looking at data that you think is more important than other data, because that happens in science all of the time. So, data that is subjective is more about opinion or personal experience. And the problem with psychology is that we're often relying on subjective information. Because when we want to study human behavior and mental process, especially that mental process piece, is about what's happening internally. And if I want to know from you what's happening inside your head, what your experiences are, then I really have to ask you. And the minute I'm asking you, I'm getting your subjective impressions about yourself and your life. And even if I'm watching you behave, there is always risk that I'm doing that in a way that is subjective or about my personal perspective. And so this is a real challenge for psychologists. And we try to be as objective as possible by doing these things listed on this slide. That we try to focus on things we can measure. And so if I want to measure anxiety, perhaps rather than asking you on a scale of 1 to 10 how anxious you are, perhaps I I take your blood pressure and your heart rate and other objective, factual, measurable pieces of evidence that might indicate how anxious you're feeling. Um, I might clearly try to define more specifically and more objectively what I want to study. So rather than saying I want to study um, parenting behaviors, maybe I say I want to study how often parents read to their children, right? You can see how that might be easier to measure in a factual way than the kind of more vague parenting behavior might be. I also need to be careful how I ask questions. So if I just ask you, are you feeling anxious? You get to interpret what I mean by that, right? Different people might interpret that differently. Anytime if you've been to the doctor or the emergency room and somebody's asked you to rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, my guess is some of you have thought, like, I don't know, like, what's a 9? Like, is my 9 the same as your 9? I don't know. And even, when I say I'm feeling very anxious, I may mean something different than that than somebody who struggles with debilitating anxiety. And if they're saying they're feeling very anxious, what they mean is they can't leave their house that day. Right? And I might mean that I'm just uncomfortable all day, but I'm doing the things I have to do. And so that's subjective. And so we can ask questions that are more clearly defined, such as, have you noticed whether your heart is racing? Have you had thoughts that were about things you're afraid of, right? At that point, we still have some subjectivity in there, but we're getting more objective. And then scientists are always, psychologists as scientists, are always obligated to avoid bias in their observations, to make sure their own expectations, their own opinions aren't influencing what they're observing, right? And so those are challenges to collecting objective data, but the fact that we're studying human beings also means we have other challenges, and the first of those is that we always have to get the permission of human beings to study them. We never can study people without their knowledge or without their consent. If I'm a biologist studying mice, I don't need their consent. We can talk about the ethics of that if you'd like, but the way we understand ethics right now is I don't need to ask the mice if it's okay. The other thing that happens when we're asking people about their mental experiences, their internal experiences, is that they can lie to us. And people routinely lie, especially if we're asking them very private or potentially embarrassing questions. The other thing is we often want to know things about people that they may not have ready access to. And sometimes that's because we're asking about complicated things. And the example I have here on the slide is, why did you fall in love with a particular person? And we may just not know. I've been married for almost 30 years, and I love my husband very much. And I can give you a list of attributes I like, but my guess is there are other people I've met with similar attributes, and I didn't fall in love with them. And so, I'm not sure I have those answers to give if a researcher was asking them. But sometimes researchers ask us questions and we simply have never kept track of that. So if somebody asked me, on average, how many hours do I spend reading a week, reading for pleasure? My answer might be lots, but I don't know. I've never tracked that. And so if somebody was asking me that on a research survey, I might give my best guesstimate. But they may not be getting very accurate information, and so we do make efforts. For example, if that was a really important piece of information, I might ask somebody to use an app to tell me every time they start reading for pleasure and then when they stop reading, so that I can actually track how often they're doing that. The problem there is the minute we start tracking behavior, we also change the behavior. We know that, and so it's very hard to get accurate information. The last thing is that often we want to study things that where we would very much like to do an experiment where we manipulate people in some way, where we change conditions in some way, and there are lots and lots of ethical guidelines that prevent us from doing a lot of things that might lead to important psychological information, but that we can't do. And so there are limits to, very hard limits to what we can do when we want to study human beings. So psychologists have all of these kind of challenges. I do want to review scientific method. My guess is most of you feel like you've had this ad nauseum since sometime in junior high school. And I've listed it here. So I'm just going to point out the things that may be different. And so most of you, if I asked you in real time what a hypothesis was, I could probably get the whole class to chant to me that is an educated guess, because that's what's been drilled into you for a very long time. Um, the thing is, they've lied to you because a hypothesis is actually an educated and testable guess. We have guesses about lots of things. We get, many of you have religious beliefs that are based on your experience or what you've been taught, right? And it's an educated guess about the existence of God. That's not testable, and it doesn't have to be testable because it's not science. There are lots of other very legitimate ways of having knowledge that are not scientific knowledge, and that's fine. Those are great. I mean, if you study philosophy, we don't expect you to be able to test those ideas. But if we're doing science, we need to be able to test those ideas. And so all hypotheses need to be testable. You need to be able to imagine a way that you could test that. And testing it involves data collection. And that's where we're going to kind of talk. The rest of this chapter is going to be about how do we collect data for psychology. The other thing I just want to touch on here a little bit is how important replication is. That after we report out on something, we need further research, either by the same researcher, but almost always by other people as well, to make sure that that was accurate and valid information. And the best example of why this is important has to do with vaccines. And, well, we may have people in the class, but certainly you know of people who say that they will not vaccinate their children, or they're concerned about vaccinating their children because of links to autism. And that information, that idea, comes from a single study, and I think it must be about 15 or 20 years ago now, if not more, a single study that found that link. You can imagine that lots of researchers were interested in replicating that data, that seemed like very important information, and lots of effort was made to replicate that data, and not one study was able to replicate that data. And as studies were unable to replicate it, it raised questions about the original study. And as people looked at that original data, they had reason to be concerned about it. And what eventually came out is that the original researcher faked his data. So it wasn't just that he found a fluke that nobody else could replicate, but in fact it was always false information. That person has lost their medical license, they are not allowed to do research or practice medicine anymore, and yet, right, the idea persists on social media and in kind of everyday thinking. It doesn't persist for scientists because the peer review process and the replication process proved it wrong. And that is why replication is so important, because one study, even a well-meaning study, never mind a fake study, a well-meaning study could find something that only happens as a fluke. And if you can't replicate it, then at some point we decide it's not actually true. So we're going to, in the next lecture, talk about how we choose and why it's important how we choose who we study. And so I'll see you there.